I don't always need to use a paintbrush to apply watercolor paint. I can use other objects such as sponges to add the paint. And sponge painting was really popular, I think, back in the 90s. A lot of people decorated their walls in their homes with it. So I have two different sponges here. The orange one is actually a synthetic sponge, just bought it at the dollar store. And this is a natural sea sponge. And each of them have different textures, so whenever I apply the paint, it's going to create some different effects. So basically I want to make sure that my sponge is damp, not soaking wet, so I'm going to dip it in the water, let it get wet, and then I'm going to squeeze out all the water. The more water I have in the sponge, the more likely the paint's going to run and drip and not really create the textures that I want. So there's two ways that I can get paint on the sponge. I can just dip it in, especially if it's nice and thin like this. I can just kind of dab it, and this is only good to do on the edges. And so I got a little bit of paint along that sponge, and then I can go ahead and just stamp it down. This is technically a stamping technique. Okay. The other thing I can do with this sponge is not just stamp it, but I can drag it, I can move it in circular motions. So I can apply the paint in different ways with the sponge to create different kind of effects. But most often we actually just stamp it down. Unfortunately, by just tapping it into the paint, don't get a lot of paint on there. So the second way of applying paint is actually probably a little bit easier, and that's to actually take the paintbrush, swirl it into the paint, and then paint the paint on the sponge. This allows me to really cover the sponge and get a lot of paint on there. Now this sponge has lots of holes and lots of divots, and so whenever I stamp it down, it's going to create all these interesting textures and bumps, and so I can just stamp it in different directions, pressing it down. And if I really wanted to show it more, I can get even more paint. The darker the paint, the more the texture is going to show through. And like I said, I can drag it, I can twist it, I can actually rock my hand back and forth and tap with different sections of the sponge. I can kind of bend the sponge and rock it or tap it, and that way my texture's random, uneven, and the same texture, the same pattern doesn't keep showing up again and again. Okay, so this is a synthetic sponge. But like I said, there are also natural sea sponges, and the natural sea sponges are a lot more random. They have a totally different texture, and so I'm going to add sort of an accent color on this. I'm going to go ahead and use some purple and paint that on. Okay, so my sponge was already damp. I had dampened them before I started just to make sure that they were nice and soft whenever I wanted to use them. So this texture is a little bit more random, it's a little bit bigger. And then quickly I have the beginnings of another page. But any of these techniques can be used on top of other techniques to create interesting layers. Okay, so there I have two different colors, and since the blue is fairly dry, the purple really doesn't bleed into it.